Welcome to my channel.
On a night like this, London hides its darkest secrets. And somewhere in this fog, a killer still walks free.
The London fog of November 1894 was of a particularly tenacious variety, a pea souper that draped the metropolis in a heavy, sulphurous shroud. From the windows of 221B Baker Street, the gas lamps below appeared as nothing more than sickly, blurred nebulae in a sea of charcoal grey. Inside, the atmosphere was scarcely more luminous. Sherlock Holmes had been in a melancholy state for days, his restless energy finding no outlet in the mundane reports of the morning papers. He spent the better part of the morning hunched over a retort, coaxing a series of pungent, iridescent vapors from a solution of coal tar derivatives. Data! Data! I cannot make bricks without clay, he suddenly exclaimed, flinging himself into his armchair and tossing a stained glass pipette onto the mahogany table. He turned his piercing hawk-like gaze upon me. "And you, Watson, have been indulging in a secret vice this morning." I looked up from my copy of the British Medical Journal, startled. "I assure you, Holmes, I have done nothing more scandalous than consume a soft boiled egg and read of the latest advancements in antiseptic surgery." Holmes chuckled, a dry, mirthless sound. "And yet, the silver nitrate stain on your left index finger suggests you have been tampering with my darkroom chemicals, while the slight indentation on your waistcoat pocket tells me you are carrying a heavy, circular object that was not there at breakfast. Since you do not possess a second pocket watch, I conclude you have fetched your old service revolver from the drawer. Why the sudden preparation for combat, my dear doctor?" I flushed, glancing at my hand. I simply thought, the fog, the reports of the metropolitan thug in the papers. I felt a certain unease, a premonition perhaps, Holmes remarked, his eyes suddenly sharpening. "For if I am not mistaken, the heavy tread upon our stairs belongs to a man who carries a burden far heavier than a Webley revolver." A moment later, the door swung open to reveal Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. He looked harassed, his collar wilted despite the morning chill, and his boots were slick with the grime of the underground. "Ah, Lestrade!" Holmes cried, his boredom vanishing like the fog before a gale. "You bring the scent of the Metropolitan Railway with you. What has happened at Baker Street Station to bring a Scotland Yard inspector to my door before the clock strikes 10? Lestrade blinked, leaning against the doorframe. "How you know these things, Holmes, I shall never fathom. Yes, it's the station. We have a riddle that's turned my stomach, and that's saying something after 15 years on the force." "A murder?" I asked. "A murder, Dr. Watson. But a murder that defies the laws of physics," Lestrade replied, stepping into the room and accepting the chair Holmes offered. "A first-class carriage on the Inner Circle line. A gentleman found dead as the train pulled into Baker Street. The door was locked from the inside, the windows were shut fast, and there isn't a mark on him. No blood, no bruising, no sign of a struggle." Holmes leaned forward, his long, thin fingers interlaced. "And the passengers?" "The carriage was empty, save for the deceased," Lestrade said. "The guard swears no one left the compartment at Edgware Road, the previous stop. It's as if the man simply withered away in the span of 4 minutes." "Fascinating," Holmes murmured, his eyes shining with a light I knew all too well. "A locked-room mystery in a moving vessel. Tell me, Lestrade, was there anything unusual about the body's position?" "Only one thing," the inspector said, lowering his voice. He was clutching a single, freshly cut white lily in his right hand, and on the floor beside him, someone had scrawled a single word in chalk: "Terminus." Holmes stood abruptly, reaching for his ulster and his deerstalker. "The game is afoot, Watson. Grab your hat and that revolver you so prophetically retrieved. We shall see if the Metropolitan Railway provides more than just transit for the weary Londoner today." The damp, sulphurous air of the Baker Street Station platform was a sharp transition from the relative comfort of our rooms. The underground, usually a cacophony of hissing steam and shuffling commuters, had fallen into an eerie, unnatural hush. Uniformed constables stood like sentinels at the entrance to the siding where the train had been diverted, their lanterns casting long, distorted shadows against the soot-stained tiles. Lestrade led us toward a first-class carriage, its door swinging open under the watchful eye of a pale, trembling station-master. "The body has not been moved, I trust?" Holmes asked, his voice echoing slightly in the subterranean gloom. "Exactly as we found it, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade replied, stepping aside to allow us entry. The interior of the compartment was a testament to Victorian luxury, upholstered in deep blue velvet with polished mahogany accents, yet the opulence only served to sharpen the macabre nature of the scene. Slumped in the corner seat, facing the direction of travel, was a man of perhaps 50 years. His attire, a heavy ulster of fine tweed, a silk cravat pinned with a modest pearl, and polished Gladstone boots, spoke of a comfortable middle-class existence. His features were frozen not in terror, but in a look of profound, almost peaceful bewilderment. His eyes remained half open, staring vacantly at the opposite seat. "Remarkable," Holmes whispered. He did not immediately approach the body, but instead stood in the doorway, his eyes darting across the floor, the ceiling, and the velvet cushions with the speed of a searching hawk. "You see, Watson? Not a speck of dust disturbed on the opposite bench. No signs of a scuffle, no tearing of the fabric. And yet, death has visited this cabin with surgical precision." I moved closer, my medical instincts overriding the chill in my marrow. I reached for the man's wrist. It was cold, and the rigidity of the muscles suggested he had passed within the hour. "There is no evidence of trauma, Holmes," I noted, peering closely at the pale skin of his neck and face. "No bruising, no petechial hemorrhaging that would suggest strangulation, and certainly no wound from a blade or bullet. Heart failure, perhaps? Yet the timing and the circumstances are too convenient for a mere accident of nature." "And the floral tribute?" Holmes asked, pointing with his cane. In the dead man's right hand, the fingers were curled loosely around the stem of a white lily. Its petals were pristine, untouched by the grime of the railway, and its fragrance, cloying and sweet, competed unpleasantly with the smell of coal smoke. Beneath the man's dangling left hand, the word terminus was written upon the floorboards in thick, jagged strokes of white chalk. Dropped to his knees, ignoring the filth of the carriage floor. He produced a magnifying glass from his pocket and began a minute examination of the chalk marks. "Common carpenter's chalk," he muttered, "but look at the pressure of the strokes. The T is heavy, the cess fades into a whisper. It was written in haste, Watson, or perhaps by a hand that was failing. And the lily, Lestrade, is there a florist within the station?" "None that would be open at such an hour, and certainly none selling lilies of this quality in November," Lestrade replied. Holmes leaned in closer to the body, his nose inches from the victim's lapel. He then examined the locks of the doors and the frames of the windows. "The doors were locked, you say?" "Bolted from the inside," the station master chimed in, stepping forward. "I had to use the master key, and even then I had to shoulder the door. The brass bolt was firmly in its socket. The windows are also latched from within." "It's a tomb, sir. A moving, iron tomb." "And the guard?" Holmes asked, rising to his full height. "He swears no one entered at Edgware Road," Lestrade said. "He was standing on the platform directly adjacent to this very carriage. He saw the gentleman sitting alone when the train departed, and he saw him in the same position when it arrived here. There was no intermediate." "Stop." Holmes walked to the window and tapped the glass. A distance of 4 minutes between stations. In that brief window, a man is killed without a mark, a lily is placed in his hand, a message is written on the floor, and the killer vanishes from a locked room. It is a problem of the highest order, Watson. He turned his attention back to the victim, reaching into the man's coat pocket and extracting a leather wallet. Inside were several pound notes, a rail pass, and a business card that read, "Mr. Arthur Pinner, Solicitor, Chancery Lane." A man of law, Holmes mused, a profession that makes many enemies but few poets. Why the lily? Why the Latin? It suggests a mind that revels in the theatrical. Suddenly he stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the soles of the victim's boots. He whipped out his glass once more. "Aha! What do you make of this, Watson?" I leaned down. Adhered to the heel of the left boot was a tiny, translucent flake, no larger than a fish scale, shimmering faintly in the gaslight. "It looks like a shard of mica, or perhaps a scale of some sort," I ventured. "Or perhaps," Holmes corrected, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "it is a clue that the deceased was not the only inhabitant of this carriage who travelled from a place far deeper than a railway tunnel." "We must move quickly, Lestrade. I suspect Mr. Pinner was merely the prologue to a much darker play. The transition from the chilling damp of the Baker Street platform to the rattling interior of a four-wheeler was a silent one. Holmes remained in a state of deep abstraction, his chin resting upon his breast and his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance that only he could perceive. Lestrade had opted to remain behind to oversee the removal of Mr. Pinner's remains and to take formal statements from the station staff, leaving Watson and Holmes to pursue the first thread of the solicitor's life. The fog had thickened into a yellowish soup, and the rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves on the cobblestones provided the only heartbeat to a city that felt increasingly like a sprawling, lightless labyrinth. "A solicitor of Chancery Lane," Holmes murmured at last, his voice cutting through the gloom of the cab. "A man whose life is dictated by the rigidity of the law, yet he meets his end in a fashion that suggests the wildest of allegories. Tell me, Watson, what do you make of the Latin? Terminus. It is the Roman god of boundaries," I replied, drawing upon the remnants of my classical education. "In common parlance, it refers to the end of a line, which is fitting enough for a railway station. But as a message left by a dying man, or a killer, it feels unnecessarily dramatic. Drama is often the mask worn by a very specific type of intent," Holmes said. "And the lily? A flower of mourning, of purity, of the resurrection. It is a curious bouquet for a man found in a first-class carriage. It suggests that Pinner was not merely a victim of a crime, but a participant in a ritual." We reached Chancery Lane as the clocks were chiming 11. The offices of Pinner and Finch were situated in a narrow, soot-blackened building tucked between a legal stationer and a dusty bookshop. Upon our entry, we were met by a junior clerk, a spindly youth whose eyes widened with alarm at the sight of Holmes's commanding presence and my own somber expression. "Is Mr. Pinner in?" Holmes asked, though the question was a mere formality. He has not arrived yet, sir," the clerk stammered. "It is most unlike him. He is usually at his desk by 9 sharp. May I ask who is calling? I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. I fear I have grave news regarding your employer. Is there a private room where we might speak?" The clerk's face drained of colour, and he led us into a cramped, wood-panelled office that smelled of old parchment and cold tobacco. This was clearly the sanctum of the deceased. Holmes did not wait for the clerk to recover his wits before he began a whirlwind tour of the room. He moved with the grace of a cat, his eyes devouring every detail of the desk, the waste-paper basket, and the heavy iron safe in the corner. He was a man of meticulous habits, Holmes observed, tapping a row of neatly filed ledgers. "Look at the inkstand, filled to the brim, the quills sharpened and ready. Yet see here." He pointed to a small silver tray on the corner of the desk meant for correspondence. It was empty, save for a single crumpled scrap of paper that seemed to have been overlooked in a recent clearing. Holmes smoothed it out on the blotter. It was a fragment of a telegram, the edges singed as if someone had attempted to burn it in haste. Only a few words remained legible. The threshold, midnight, the white lily, awaits. The threshold, I whispered. Another boundary, another terminus. Precisely, Holmes said, his voice crackling with excitement. And look at the floor beneath the desk, Watson. What do you see? I bent down, squinting at the dark rug. There, catching a stray beam of light, were several more of the shimmering, translucent flakes we had seen on the victim's boot. Up close, they did not look like mica. They had a distinct, organic curvature. They are scales, I said, my medical training coming to the fore. But not from any fish I recognize. They are too thick, too iridescent. Indeed, Holmes replied, picking one up with his tweezers and holding it to the light. They are the scales of the Lepidosiren paradoxa, the South American lungfish, a creature that lives in the deepest, most stagnant mud, capable of surviving for years in a state of suspended animation. A rare specimen, Watson. One that would not be found in a solicitor's office unless he had been frequenting a very particular type of establishment. He turned abruptly to the trembling clerk who stood in the doorway. Tell me, did Mr. Pinner have any clients of an eccentric nature, perhaps a naturalist or a collector of rare antiquities? The clerk swallowed hard. There was a gentleman, sir, a Mr. Silas Vane. He came several times last week. They had long private meetings. Mr. Pinner seemed changed afterward, agitated. He told me he was handling a matter of spiritual significance that went beyond the law. Silas Vane, Holmes repeated, the name tasting like a mystery on his tongue. And where might we find this Mr. Vane? He leaves his cards at the Diogenes Club, sir, though he mentioned a laboratory near the docks, a place he called the Grotto. Holmes's eyes flashed. The Grotto. A fitting home for a lungfish, and perhaps for a killer who walks through locked doors. Come, Watson. The mist is thickening, and I suspect the terminus as Mr. Pinner reached was only the beginning of a much longer journey into the depths. As we stepped back into the street, the fog seemed to press in closer, as if the city itself were trying to keep its secrets buried in the mud of the Thames. The journey toward the East End was a descent into a gloom even deeper than that which smothered the city's heart. As our cab rattled eastward, the refined air of Chancery Lane was replaced by the pungent odours of the river, a thick melange of rotting timber, stagnant water, and the heavy, sweet scent of imported spices. Holmes remained silent, his eyes closed, his thin lips moving as if he were rehearsing a difficult piece of music. I, meanwhile, could not banish the image of the white lily from my mind. In the language of flowers, it was a symbol of the grave, yet in the hands of Mr. Arthur Pinner, it felt like a brand of shame. The lungfish, Watson, Holmes said suddenly, his eyes snapping open as we passed the looming silhouette of the tower, a creature that survives the drying of its world by burying itself in the mud, waiting for the rains to return. It is a symbol of endurance, of a life that persists when all other things have perished. If Mr. Silas Vane is indeed a student of such things, he is a man interested in the boundaries between life and the void. A macabre interest for a solicitor's client, I remarked, or a very profitable one, if one is selling the hope of such endurance to those who fear the end. Here we are. The cab pulled up at the end of a narrow, slick alleyway near Wapping. The building before us was a cavernous, derelict warehouse, its brickwork blackened by generations of soot. Above the sagging wooden doors, a faded sign bore the name Vane & Company, Biological Imports, but a more recent hand had scrawled the word Grotto in chalk, the same white, jagged chalk that had marked the floor of the railway carriage. The air inside the warehouse was oppressive, thick with a humidity that made my collar wilt instantly. It was not a laboratory in any conventional sense, but a sanctuary of shadows. Rows of glass tanks lined the walls, filled with murky green water that bubbled softly. In the dim light of our lanterns, I saw the sluggish movements of prehistoric shapes, thick, eel-like bodies with lidless eyes, that seemed to watch our intrusion with ancient indifference. "The Lepida siren," Holmes whispered, tapping the glass of a central tank. "And look, Watson, the water is littered with the very scales we found on Pinner's boot." He moved deeper into the warehouse, his lantern casting long, flickering fingers of light into the corners. At the far end of the room stood a heavy oak desk, its surface cluttered with anatomical sketches and botanical prints. But it was not the sketches that caught my eye, it was the smell. Over the stench of the tanks rose the unmistakable cloying scent of lilies. On a pedestal beside the desk sat a large ceramic bowl filled with water. Floating upon the surface were a dozen white lilies, their petals glowing like ivory in the darkness. Beside them lay a list of names, written in a cramped scholarly hand. Arthur Pinner's name was at the top, struck through with a single thick line of black ink. "A hit list, Holmes?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Worse, Watson." "A roster," Holmes replied, picking up a small leather-bound volume that lay open on the desk. He leafed through it quickly, his brow furrowing. "This is a record of transactions. Pinner was not just a lawyer, he was a gatekeeper. He was managing the estates of men who believed they could take their wealth with them into the next state. And here, look at the second name on the list." He pointed to the name, Sir George Morstan, Member of Parliament. "Morstan," I exclaimed. "The Under-Secretary for the Home Office? He is to give the keynote address at the opening of the new bridge tomorrow. And beneath his name," Holmes added, his voice grim, "is the time 12:15, the same time as the midnight express from Baker Street. We are not dealing with a lone madman, Watson. We are dealing with an architect of death who uses the symbols of life as his signature. But how does he kill in a locked room? How did he strike Pinner without leaving a mark?" He suddenly knelt, sniffing the air near the desk, then reached under the floorboards where a loose plank had been partially pried up. He pulled out a small brass canister, its nozzle stained with a faint crystalline residue. "An anesthetic?" I ventured. "More potent," Holmes said, standing up and tucking the canister into his pocket. "A derivative of the lungfish's own dormant mucus, concentrated into a vapor. It paralyzes the respiratory system in seconds, leaving the heart to flutter until it stops. Yet it evaporates so quickly that no trace remains in the blood. It is a natural death, Watson, manufactured by a very unnatural mind. But look, what is this?" From the shadows behind the desk, a figure emerged. It was not Silas Vane, but a woman, her face veiled in black lace, her movements as silent as a ghost's. In her hand, she held a small silver whistle. "You should not have come to the grotto, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice a melodic, chilling whisper. "Some boundaries are meant to be crossed only once." Before Holmes could react, she blew a sharp, piercing note on the whistle. From the rafters above, a heavy iron grate began to descend, threatening to seal the only exit from the warehouse. "The trap is sprung," Holmes cried, seizing my arm. "The window, Watson, the window!" The screech of the iron grate was a sound of finality, a heavy, rhythmic clatter of metal against stone that promised a cold and watery grave. Holmes did not hesitate for a heartbeat. His movements, usually so calculated and precise, became a blur of frantic energy. He lunged toward the high, soot-streaked window that overlooked the wharf, his heavy walking stick held aloft. With a single, powerful strike, the glass shattered, the shards tinkling like ice against the warehouse floor. "Up, Watson!" "Your hand, man! Quickly!" Watson felt the surge of adrenaline as he grasped Holmes's outstretched hand. With a heave that strained his old wound, he was hoisted onto the ledge, just as the iron teeth of the grate slammed into the floorboards with a bone-jarring thud, sealing the grotto from the inside. The woman in the black veil did not stay to witness their escape. She moved with a fluid, spectral grace, melting into the labyrinth of glass tanks and shadows. By the time Watson had tumbled onto the slick, mud-caked timber of the wharf, she was gone, leaving only the cloying scent of lilies and the rhythmic bubbling of the lungfish tanks behind her. The cold air of the Thames bit at their faces, a stark contrast to the stifling humidity of the warehouse. Holmes stood on the wharf, his chest heaving slightly, his eyes scouring the swirling fog for any sign of their assailant. But the East End had swallowed her whole. Far off, the mournful low of a foghorn signalled the passage of a steamer, a lonely sound in the dark. "A near thing, Watson," Holmes remarked, his voice returning to its usual cool, detached register. He adjusted his ulster and retrieved the brass canister from his pocket, turning it over in his long, slender fingers. Our veiled friend was not merely a guardian, she was a distraction. While we were admiring her theatricality, the architect of this scheme was undoubtedly moving toward his next objective. "Sir George Morstan," Watson panted, brushing the grime from his coat. "If that list is to be believed, he is in mortal danger." 12:15, Holmes. That gives us little over an hour to reach him. But how do we warn a man of his stature based on a scrap of paper found in a warehouse of fish? "We do not merely warn him, Watson, we intercept the hand that strikes him," Holmes replied, his pace quickening as they hurried toward the main road to find a cab. "Consider the logic of the first murder. Pinner was killed in a moving carriage locked from within. The vapor I found is the key. It is silent, invisible, and leaves the victim looking as though they have simply drifted into sleep. It is the perfect tool for a public assassination. Morstan is to speak at the opening of the new bridge, but before that, he travels by the very same line Pinner took. It is his routine. They managed to hail a passing hansom, the horse's hooves sparking against the wet cobbles as they swung inside. Holmes leaned back, the flickering gaslight of the street lamps illuminating the sharp, hawk-like contours of his face. He seemed to be assembling a mental jigsaw puzzle, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. "The white lily," Holmes mused, almost to himself. "It is more than a signature. It is a signal. In the telegram it said, 'The threshold, midnight. The white lily awaits.' The threshold is the station, Watson, the transition point. Pinner reached his terminus at Baker Street. Morstan is intended to reach his at the Midnight Express. But there is a missing link. Why would a solicitor and a member of Parliament be targeted by a man who deals in biological curiosities from South America? Perhaps it is not what they do, but what they know," Watson suggested. "Pinner managed estates. Morstan is with the Home Office. Could there be a common thread of a hidden fortune, or perhaps a secret that Silas Vane is desperate to keep buried in the mud?" "A keen observation, Watson," Holmes said, tapping the canister against his chin. "Vane is a man who studies life in stasis, creatures that wait for the right moment to emerge. I suspect this grotto is merely the local branch of a much larger, much older conspiracy. The scales on the floor, the Latin on the boards. It all points to a mind steeped in the ritualistic. But look at this." He pulled the crumpled telegram fragment from his pocket and held it under the cab's small internal lamp. The ink on the word Morstan is slightly different from the rest. It was added later. This is not a static list, it is an evolving one, and if Morstan is the next terminus, we must ensure that the line ends before he boards that train. The cab swerved sharply as they neared Westminster, the towering silhouette of Big Ben looming through the mist like a giant sentinel. The clock face glowed with a pale, ghostly light, the hands creeping inexorably toward the midnight hour. Suspense hung heavy in the air, a palpable weight that seemed to stifle the very breath in Watson's lungs. They were racing against a killer who moved like a shadow and struck with the breath of the abyss, and the cold realization dawned on Watson that they were no longer just investigators. They were the only shield between a high official and a silent, floral death. "Driver, faster!" Holmes shouted through the trapdoor. "The life of the Empire may well depend on the speed of your horse tonight." The hansom cab skidded to a violent halt outside the Marylebone entrance of Baker Street Station, the horse's breath blooming in the frigid air like a dragon's fire. Holmes was out of the door before the wheels had ceased their protest against the cobbles. his long legs carrying him toward the iron-wrought gates with a speed that I, despite my military training, found difficult to match. The station, a cavernous ribcage of iron and glass, was nearly deserted at this hour, save for a few weary travellers huddled on benches and the rhythmic, echoing hiss of steam from the idling locomotives. "The clock, Watson! The clock!" Holmes commanded, gesturing toward the great dial that overlooked the platforms. It was 12:10. We had 5 minutes before the midnight express was due to depart. "There!" I cried, pointing toward platform 3. A tall, distinguished gentleman in a charcoal overcoat and a silk top hat stood conversing with a railway official. Beside him, a valet tended to a collection of leather trunks. Even from a distance, the aristocratic bearing of Sir George Morstan was unmistakable. He appeared relaxed, the very picture of Victorian stability, utterly unaware that he was the next name on a list of the damned. Holmes, however, did not approach him directly. Instead, he slowed his pace, his eyes darting with a feverish intensity that bordered on the erratic. He began to move in a zigzag pattern across the platform, sniffing the air and occasionally dropping to one knee to examine the soot-covered floorboards. To a casual observer, he would have seemed a madman, but I knew he was hunting for the invisible, the faint shimmering trail of the lungfish scales or the cloying scent of the lily. "Holmes, we must warn him," I urged, my hand instinctively resting on the grip of the revolver in my pocket. "He's about to board." "Patience, Watson," Holmes hissed, his voice sharp and brittle. "If we move too soon, the Viper will simply retreat into the shadows. We must find the delivery mechanism. The canister I found was small, meant for a localized strike, but for a man of Morstan's importance, in a public space, the architect would require something more systemic." Suddenly, Holmes stopped dead in his tracks. His gaze was fixed on a small, unobtrusive ventilation grate set into the wall of the private first-class waiting room, directly adjacent to where Morstan stood. A faint, greenish vapor, almost imperceptible against the backdrop of the station's natural steam, was beginning to curl outward. "The lungs of the station," Holmes whispered, his face pale with a sudden, terrible realization. "He isn't just killing a man, he's suffocating a boundary." He turned and sprinted, not toward Morstan, but toward the station's service corridor. I followed, my boots thudding against the stone. We burst through a door marked "Staff Only" and found ourselves in a narrow, dimly lit passage that ran behind the waiting rooms. The smell of the grotto was here, thicker, more concentrated. And there, slumped against a stack of coal sacks, was a second victim. It was the station guard we had seen earlier on the platform, or rather, the man who should have been the guard. He was cold, his eyes staring at the ceiling in that same look of peaceful bewilderment we had seen on Arthur Pinner. In his hand, a white lily was clutched so tightly that the stem had begun to snap. "A second crime to mask the first," I murmured, checking the man's pulse, though I knew it was futile. "The guard was a man of the people, Watson. A simple obstacle," Holmes said, his voice trembling with a rare suppressed fury. "But look at his uniform." The man's heavy blue tunic had been stripped of its brass buttons and its distinctive red piping. Someone had taken the identity of the law to facilitate a murder. Holmes stood up, his eyes flashing with a cold, predatory light. He began to pace the narrow corridor, his hands twitching at his sides as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a terrifying speed. "It is not about the money, Watson, nor is it about a hidden fortune. Pinner managed the deeds to the city's underground developments. Morstan oversees the security of the same. The terminus isn't just a destination, it's a demolition. They are clearing the path for something that lives in the mud to rise to the surface." He suddenly grabbed me by the shoulders, his grip like iron. "Watson, go to Morstan. Do not tell him he is in danger. Tell him there is a leak in the gas mains and he must evacuate to the street immediately. Use your medical authority." I must find the impostor before he releases the primary charge. And you? I asked. I am going to become a shadow, Holmes replied, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. He pulled a tattered neckerchief from his pocket and tied it around his face, masking his features. The midnight express will not be leaving the station tonight, but someone is going to reach their final terminus nonetheless. I turned to run back toward the platform, but a sudden sharp hiss echoed through the service corridor, the sound of a valve being opened. A thick, white cloud began to pour from the ventilation pipes above us. It was not the lethal vapor yet, but a blinding, opaque screen. Through the mist, I saw a figure standing at the end of the hall, a man in a guard's uniform, his face obscured by a gas mask that gave him the appearance of a monstrous, lidless insect. In his hand, he held a silver whistle, and as he raised it to his lips, the ground beneath us seemed to groan with the weight of an approaching doom. The piercing note of the whistle sliced through the thick, artificial fog with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, signaling a chaos that was as sudden as it was blinding. The white cloud, thick and smelling faintly of ozone and stagnant mud, billowed around me, turning the familiar iron architecture of Baker Street Station into a realm of shifting ghosts. I could no longer see the entrance to the service corridor, nor could I see Holmes, who had vanished into the swirling opacity with the silent purpose of a spectral hound. My own lungs burned with the effort of breathing, and the tingling in my nostrils served as a grim reminder of the lethal vapor that surely followed this smoke screen. I pressed my handkerchief to my face, my hand gripping the Webley in my pocket, and stumbled back toward the platform, guided only by the rhythmic, heavy thumping of the express engine's pistons. "Sir George! Sir George Morstan!" I bellowed, my voice sounding muffled and distant even to my own ears. I burst through the fringe of the cloud onto the platform, where the air was marginally clearer. The scene was one of bewildered panic. Sir George had recoiled from the ventilation grate, his silk hat falling to the soot-stained floor, while his valet made a futile attempt to shield his master with a heavy leather valise. The few commuters nearby were fleeing toward the exits, their cries echoing hauntingly in the vast station vault. "Dr. Watson, what is the meaning of this outrage?" Sir George cried, his face a mask of aristocratic indignation, though I could see the tremor in his hands. "There is no time for explanations, Sir George," I said, seizing him by the arm with a firmness that brooked no argument. "The gas mains have been compromised. This station is a death trap. You must come with me to the street at once." My medical authority, forged in the heat of Afghan skirmishes, acted as a tonic to his confusion. I began to half lead, half drag him toward the Marylebone exit, my eyes darting back to the shifting wall of smoke we had just abandoned. It was then that I saw it, the monstrous silhouette of the masked guard emerging from the gloom. The figure did not run, it prowled, its glass-eyed mask catching the flicker of the gas lamps like the lidless stare of a deep-sea predator. In its right hand, it held a long, slender glass tube connected to a bellows, a more sophisticated version of the canister Holmes had recovered. The killer's objective was clear. He was not interested in the crowd, only in the man whose arm I held. "Down, Sir George, down!" I shouted, shoving the Member of Parliament behind a heavy luggage trolley, just as the masked figure raised the glass instrument. But before the assassin could depress the bellows, a second figure lunged from the shadows of a nearby pillar. It was a man dressed in the tattered, grease-stained overalls of a coal heaver, his face blackened with soot and his movements possessing a frantic, uncoordinated energy. To any observer, it appeared a desperate vagrant was attempting a clumsy robbery, but the precision with which the heaver struck the assassin's wrist told a different story. The glass tube shattered against the iron trolley, releasing a localized puff of green vapor that dissipated harmlessly into the larger smoke screen. The masked man let out a muffled snarl of rage and swung a heavy fist, but the coal-heaver dodged with a grace that was unmistakably Holmesian. In the struggle, the tattered neckerchief fell from my friend's face, revealing the sharp, hawk-like features and the blazing intensity of his eyes. "The game is up, Vane!" Holmes cried, his voice ringing out over the hiss of the steam. "I have redirected the primary flow. Your grotto is being vented into the open sky even as we speak." The assassin, realizing his primary weapon was destroyed and his identity challenged, did not flee. Instead, he reached into his tunic and drew a long, curved blade, a flensing knife used for biological specimens. He lunged at Holmes with a ferocity born of desperation. Holmes, armed only with his heavy walking stick, parried the blow with a crack of timber that echoed like a pistol shot. "Watson, the valve!" Holmes shouted, never taking his eyes off his opponent. "Behind the third pillar, the brass lever. Turn it to the right, or we shall all be breathing the mud of the Amazon." I scrambled toward the pillar, my fingers slick with cold sweat as I found the lever Holmes indicated. It was locked with a heavy padlock, but I did not hesitate. I drew my revolver and, using the butt of the weapon as a hammer, struck the lock with all my might. It snapped on the third blow. I wrenched the lever over, and a deep, mechanical groan vibrated through the station floorboards. The hissing ceased, and the green tint in the air began to fade, sucked back into the bowels of the station's plumbing. I turned back to the struggle just in time to see Holmes deliver a sharp, calculated blow to the assassin's temple. The man crumpled, his mask hitting the floorboards with a hollow, metallic thud. Holmes stood over him, breathing heavily, his coal-heaver's rags torn and his face smeared with grime, yet he had never looked more triumphant. "A strategic play, Watson," Holmes panted, adjusting his tattered collar. He thought to use the station's own lungs to deliver his poison, but he forgot that a lung can be made to exhale as easily as it can be made to inhale. "Sir George, I believe you owe the doctor here your life, and perhaps a very thorough explanation of your dealings with the estate of the late Arthur Pinner." Sir George, still huddled behind the trolley, looked from the unconscious assassin to Holmes with a mixture of terror and dawning realization. The terminus had been reached, but it was the killer who had found the end of his line. However, as Holmes knelt to unmask the fallen man, his expression suddenly shifted from triumph to a cold, renewed alertness. "Watson," he whispered, his voice dropping to a low, urgent register. "This is not Silas Vane. This is merely a pawn. The master of the grotto is still at large, and I suspect he has one final move to make before the clock strikes the half-hour." The mechanical groan of the redirected ventilation system provided a somber undercurrent to the silence that now fell over the platform. Holmes, still clad in his soot-stained coal-heaver's rags, reached down and tore the rubberized mask from the unconscious man's face. Expecting the gaunt, scholarly features of Silas Vane, I was instead met with the sight of a coarse, undistinguished face, a common ruffian whose only distinction was a jagged scar running across a cauliflower ear. "As I suspected," Holmes murmured, his voice tight with a mixture of annoyance and grim satisfaction. "A mercenary from the London docks. A man who understands the weight of gold but knows nothing of the philosophy of the lungfish or the poetry of the white lily." He looked up at me, his eyes sharp. "Vane is a man of intellect, Watson. He would never risk his own person on a platform when he could manipulate the very atmosphere from a distance." I helped Sir George Morstan to his feet. The statesman was trembling, his composure shattered like the glass tube that had nearly ended his life. "Mr. Holmes," he stammered, clutching his bruised arm. I don't know how to thank you. But what did you mean about my dealings with Pinner? I have never met the man in my life." Holmes stood up, brushing the coal dust from his sleeves with a rhythmic, impatient motion. "Not in person, perhaps, but your signature appears on the deeds for the new Thames Embankment project, deeds that Arthur Pinner was tasked with notarizing. The terminus, written in chalk, was not merely a threat, it was a geographical marker. Pinner and Morstan were the two pillars holding up a very specific legal barrier. With Pinner dead, and you incapacitated, the rights to the subterranean channels beneath the new bridge would have reverted to a dormant corporation. Vane and Company, the grotto, I whispered, the pieces finally falling into place. It wasn't just a laboratory for exotic fish, it was a staging ground. Exactly, Watson, Holmes said, beginning to pace the platform with a predatory energy. The lungfish survives by burying itself in the mud of a drying world. Vane saw a parallel in the City of London. He sought to create a stasis in the heart of the British Empire by seizing control of its most vital new arteries, the tunnels and conduits of the embankment. By removing those who held the legal and political keys, he could emerge from the mud of the East End as the proprietor of the city's future. He turned back to the unconscious henchman and began searching the man's pockets with a practiced, lightning-fast efficiency. He produced a small silver pocket watch, the same type I had seen on the desk in the warehouse, and a folded slip of paper. He smoothed the paper out, and I saw a crude map of the station's lower maintenance levels, marked with several red crosses. "He is not finished, Watson," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. The distraction on the platform was meant to occupy us while the true architect reached the threshold. Look at the crosses. They coincide with the main structural supports of the Baker Street tunnel. Vane doesn't just want to control the arteries, he wants to rupture them. He means to blow up the station, I gasped. Not with explosives, Holmes corrected, pointing to the silver watch. The bezel is not a timekeeper. It is a remote trigger for a pressurized release. If he releases the full concentration of that lungfish vapor into the lower tunnels while a train is passing, the resulting vacuum and respiratory paralysis will turn the underground into a mass grave, a literal terminus for hundreds of souls. Sir George leaned against the luggage trolley, his face ashen. But why? To what end? "Chaos is the ultimate lubricant for a new order, Sir George," Holmes replied, already moving toward the iron staircase that led to the lower depths. In the panic that follows, Vane's corporation would step in to restore and secure the works, with no one left to question his title. It is a crime of Darwinian proportions. Watson, your revolver. We must descend into the pit. We left Lestrade's arriving constables to attend to the prisoner and Sir George, plunging once more into the humid, sulphurous dark of the maintenance tunnels. The air here was even heavier, vibrating with the distant roar of the city above and the rhythmic thrumming of the pumps. As we rounded a sharp corner, the beam of Holmes's lantern caught a flash of white. There, placed atop a heavy iron valve, was a single, pristine white lily. Beside it stood a figure in a long, dark frock coat, his back to us, his hands moving with meticulous care over a series of brass gauges. "Mr. Silas Vane, I presume?" Holmes's voice echoed through the tunnel, cold and clear as a winter bell. The figure turned slowly. He was a man of middle age, with a high, intellectual forehead and eyes that seemed to burn with a cold, pale fire. The eyes of a man who had spent too long staring into the mud of the abyss. He did not look like a killer. He looked like a prophet. "You are late, Mr. Holmes," Vane said, his voice a melodic, terrifying whisper. "The rains have already begun to fall, and the mud is softening. The threshold is crossed." He held up the silver watch, his thumb resting on the crown. "One more step, and I shall breathe the life of the grotto into the very lungs of London." The humid air of the maintenance tunnel felt as though it had been replaced by liquid lead, pressing against my chest with every shallow breath. Before us stood Silas Vane, a man who had traded the sanctuary of his academic grotto for the dark theater of mass murder. He stood with a calm, terrifying poise, his thumb poised over the silver watch's crown. The single white lily on the valve between us seemed to glow with a sickly phosphorescent light in the beam of Holmes's lantern. "You speak of thresholds, Vane, yet you stand upon the precipice of a common gallows," Holmes said, his voice devoid of tremor, though I could see the slight tensing of his jaw. He did not raise his walking stick. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward, his shadow stretching long and distorted against the sweating brickwork. "Your Darwinian struggle is a fantasy. You are not the lungfish surviving the drought. You are merely the parasite attempting to poison the host." Vane smiled, a thin, bloodless expression. "A parasite provides nothing. I provide a new order. London is a dying world, Holmes. It is choked by its own complexity, its own laws, and its own stagnant traditions. I am the rain that brings the mud, and from that mud, a stronger, more resilient creature will emerge. If a few hundred souls must reach their terminus tonight to secure the future of the city's infrastructure, it is a small price for evolution." "Evolution requires a survivor, not a tyrant," Holmes countered, his eyes flicking for a fraction of a second toward the brass gauges behind Vane. "I noticed your pressure readings. You've already opened the secondary bypass. If you depress that crown now, the back pressure will rupture the primary canister before the vapor reaches the main tunnels. You won't be a prophet, Vane. You'll be the first casualty of your own reign." Vane's eyes wavered, just for an instant. It was the flicker of a man whose intellect was his greatest strength and his most vulnerable point of pride. He glanced back at the gauges, his thumb loosening its grip ever so slightly. "Do not look, Vane," I shouted, stepping to the side to draw his attention away from Holmes. "My friend is a master of the bluff, but my revolver is quite real. Drop the watch, or I shall ensure your evolution ends right here in the soot." "Bluff?" Vane whispered, his gaze snapping back to Holmes. "No, Sherlock Holmes does not bluff with the lives of thousands. He calculates." He looked at the gauges again, his brow furrowing as he tried to reconcile his own meticulous planning with Holmes's assertion. "The bypass. I sealed it myself. And I unsealed it," Holmes lied with such cold, absolute conviction that even I felt a pang of doubt. "While you were watching your pawn fail on the platform, I was in the service ducts. You are a student of biology, Vane, but you have forgotten the basic mechanics of the very station you seek to inhabit. The pressure is critical. Press it, and we all reach the terminus together." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thud of a train passing on the upper levels, the 12:15 express, carrying the very lives Vane sought to extinguish. The vibration rattled the pipes, and a small flake of mica, or perhaps another lungfish scale, fell from the ceiling, shimmering as it drifted through the air. Vane's face contorted, a mask of intellectual agony. The logic of his survival fought against the fanaticism of his vision. "You would die here? For a city that doesn't even know your name?" "I would die to ensure a man like you never writes it in the mud," Holmes replied. He was now only 5 feet away. In a sudden, desperate movement, Vane didn't press the crown. He lunged for the main manual lever behind the valve, seeking to bypass the watch entirely. "Now, Watson," Holmes cried. I fired. The bullet didn't strike Vane, but the heavy brass padlock of the main lever, shattering it in a spray of sparks. The impact jarred the mechanism, and the lever jammed halfway. At the same moment, Holmes leaped forward, his long arms wrapping around Vane's waist and driving him back against the iron pipes. The silver watch flew from Vane's hand, skittering across the wet floor toward a deep drainage sump. I scrambled forward, reaching for the watch before it could plunge into the dark water. My fingers brushed the cold metal just as it tipped over the edge. I caught it by the chain, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked up to see Holmes and Vane locked in a primal struggle amidst the hiss of escaping steam. Vane was surprisingly strong, fueled by a madman's conviction, but Holmes moved with a wiry, desperate ferocity. With a final guttural heave, Holmes pinned Vane against the main boilerplate. "It is over, Silas. The express has passed. The threshold is closed." Vane slumped, the fire in his eyes dying out as the sound of the receding train echoed above. He looked at the shattered lily on the floor, then at Holmes, his face suddenly old and hollow. The mud. The mud will always be there, Holmes. You have only delayed the inevitable. Holmes didn't answer. He held the man firmly until the heavy tread of Lestrade's constables finally echoed through the tunnel, their lanterns cutting through the gloom like the first rays of a cold grey dawn. As they led Vane away, Holmes turned to me, his face smeared with soot and his eyes reflecting a profound, weary exhaustion. "He was right about one thing, Watson," Holmes murmured, picking up the broken lily. "The mud is always there. But as long as there is a light to show where the boundary lies, we might yet keep the city from sinking into it." He looked at the silver watch in my hand. "A clever device. We shall have to see what Mycroft makes of it. But for now, I believe a very large breakfast and a very long sleep are the only termini I wish to reach." The grey, spectral light of a London dawn was beginning to filter through the heavy velvet curtains of 221B Baker Street by the time we returned. The city outside was waking to a morning that felt entirely ordinary, its millions of inhabitants blissfully unaware of the silent, floral death that had almost swept through the veins of their transit system. Inside our sitting room, the fire had sunk to a heap of glowing embers, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the chemical retorts and stacked monographs. Holmes, having shed his coal-heaver's rags for a dressing gown of deep plum silk, sat in his customary armchair, his long legs stretched toward the hearth and his eyes fixed upon the ceiling. "It is the theatricality that nearly saved him, Watson," Holmes remarked, breaking a long silence. He held the silver watch, the trigger that had almost signaled a massacre, between his thumb and forefinger. Vane was not content with mere political power or the acquisition of land. He viewed himself as a sculptor of the human condition. The white lily, the Latin scrawled in chalk, the use of the lungfish, it was all a grand allegory for his belief that only those who can adapt to the mud deserve to inherit the earth. I sat opposite him, nursing a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. My mind was still in the tunnels, hearing the hiss of the steam and the cold, melodic whisper of a man who saw mass murder as evolution. But the mechanics of it, Holmes. How did he manage the locked carriage with Pinner? Even with the vapor, the doors were bolted from the inside. Holmes leaned forward, a ghost of a smile playing upon his thin lips. A master of biology must also be a master of the environment. Do you remember the meticulous habits the clerk mentioned at Pinner's office? Pinner always took the same carriage, the same seat, at the same time. Vane, disguised as the station guard, the very man we found dead in the corridor, had access to the carriages while they were in the siding. He did not need to enter the carriage to kill Pinner. He merely had to ensure the ventilation slat above Pinner's preferred seat was coated with a slow-release crystalline form of that lungfish toxin. "And the locked door?" I asked. "The bolt was never thrown by Pinner," Holmes explained, tapping his pipe against the grate. Vane used a simple magnetic lead from the exterior of the door, a trick often used by card sharps and stage magicians, to slide the brass bolt into place once the train began to move. To the station master at Baker Street, it appeared a locked-room mystery. To Silas Vane, it was merely an airtight laboratory experiment. He placed the lily in Pinner's hand through the open window at the previous stop, Edgware Road, using his authority as a guard to stand on the footboard, unnoticed in the fog. And Sir George Morstan? Sir George was the final obstacle, Holmes said, his gaze turning sombre. As the Under-Secretary, he was the only man with the power to audit the deeds Pinner had notarized. By removing him during a public event, Vane would have created a vacuum of authority. The grotto would have moved in to fill that vacuum, presenting themselves as the saviors of the city's infrastructure, while secretly holding it hostage. He reached for a small, leather-bound volume, the ledger we had recovered from the warehouse. Vane's error was the common error of the intellectual criminal. He assumed that because he understood the laws of nature, he was exempt from the laws of man. He forgot that even the lungfish, for all its endurance, is helpless if the mud in which it hides is disturbed by a persistent enough predator. I looked out the window as the first rays of a weak winter sun touched the rooftops. The horror of the night was beginning to recede, replaced by the mundane reality of the morning papers and the rattling of the milk carts. Yet, I knew that the grotto would remain in my dreams for some time, the image of those lidless eyes in the murky green water, waiting for the world to dry. "You have done a great service for the Empire tonight, Holmes," I said quietly. "I have solved a puzzle, Watson," he replied, closing his eyes. "The Empire will continue to stumble along its path, oblivious to the precipices it skirts. But for now, the air is clear, the lilies are withered, and I believe the metropolitan thug has been replaced in the headlines by a much more interesting case of a missing ruby in Kensington." He drifted into a light sleep, the silver watch still clutched in his hand like a trophy from a war fought in the shadows. I picked up my pen to record the events of the last 24 hours, knowing that while the world might never know the name of Silas Vane, it would forever be indebted to the man who sat across from me, the one man in London who could look into the mud and see not just the creature within, but the logic of the entire abyss. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock and the soft, steady breathing of my friend. I sat for a long while, the pen poised over my journal, reflecting on the sheer scale of the disaster that had been averted. The terminus Vane had envisioned was a chilling reminder of how fragile the veneer of our civilization truly is. As the sun climbed higher, casting a pale gold light across the chaotic map of London spread upon our table, the doorbell rang with a sharp, insistent urgency that shattered the morning's stillness. Holmes was awake in an instant. The languor of a moment before vanished, replaced by that keen electric alertness that characterized his every waking hour during a case. "A visitor, Watson." And if I am not mistaken by the heavy, authoritative ring, it is a gentleman who has had a very restless night at the Home Office. Our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, showed in Sir George Morstan. He was no longer the shattered figure of the previous night. Clad in a fresh frock coat and carrying a bundle of official documents, he looked every bit the powerful administrator, though the dark circles beneath his eyes betrayed his ordeal. Behind him followed Lestrade, looking uncharacteristically sombre. "Mr. Holmes," Sir George began, his voice resonant with a formal gravity. "I have spent the dawn hours with the Prime Minister and the Commissioner. The scale of Silas Vane's network is staggering. We have raided 3 more biological imports warehouses in the East End. In each we found the same pressurized canisters, the same lungfish tanks, and lists of names that would make your blood run cold." "A subterranean empire," Holmes murmured, rising to greet them. "I trust the arrests were made quietly?" "As quietly as such things can be," Lestrade interjected, taking a seat and mopping his brow. "But Vane is refusing to speak. He sits in his cell at Newgate, staring at the wall as if he's waiting for a tide that only he can see. However, we found something in his personal safe that we couldn't decipher. It's a ledger, but not like the one you found at the grotto. This one is written in a code that has baffled our best cryptographers." He placed a small, vellum-bound book on the table. Holmes snatched it up, his eyes alight with a sudden, renewed fire. He flipped through the pages, his long, thin fingers tracing the lines of intricate, geometric symbols that resembled a cross between ancient runes and chemical formulas. "A polyalphabetic cipher with a botanical key," Holmes whispered, more to himself than to us. "Look here, Watson. The frequency of the symbols correlates with the flowering seasons of the British Isles. Vane wasn't just planning a single strike, he was mapping out a multi-year cycle of purification." "There is something else," Sir George said, his voice dropping. "The ledger mentions a silent partner, a financier referred to only as the gardener. It seems Vane was the architect, but someone else provided the vast sums required to procure the South American specimens and bribe the railway officials. Someone with deep pockets and an even deeper reach into the heart of the city. Holmes stiffened, his gaze fixed on a particular entry in the back of the book. "The gardener," he repeated, the words tasting like ash. "A man who cultivates death from a distance. Tell me, Sir George, was there any mention of a property in the countryside? A manor, perhaps, with extensive glass houses?" "As a matter of fact, yes," Sir George replied, looking startled. "A place called Blackwood Hall in Surrey. It was purchased through a holding company last year." "Why do you ask?" Holmes turned to the window, his expression unreadable. "Because, my dear Sir George, Silas Vane was the lungfish, the creature that hides in the mud. But every lungfish requires a pond, and the gardener has been preparing the soil for far longer than we realized. The case of the Baker Street murder was merely the clearing of the weeds." He turned back to us, his eyes flashing with a cold, resolute light. "Watson, I fear our breakfast must wait. The sun may be up over London, but in the quiet corners of Surrey, the most poisonous flowers are only just beginning to bloom. Lestrade, I shall need a carriage and 3 of your most discreet men. We are going to pay a visit to Blackwood Hall." As we prepared to depart once more, the sense of triumph I had felt earlier evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The terminus we had reached at the station was not the end of the line, but merely a junction. The master of the grotto had been caught, but the hand that had planted the seeds was still at work, and I knew that the true roots of this conspiracy ran deeper than any railway tunnel in London. The journey to Surrey was a sombre affair, conducted in a private railway carriage that felt like a rolling cage of iron and anticipation. As the urban sprawl of London gave way to the skeletal trees and frost-bitten fields of the countryside, Holmes remained buried in Vane's vellum ledger, his magnifying glass hovering over the cryptic symbols like a questing insect. He spoke little, but the rhythmic tapping of his fingers against the glass pane betrayed the frantic velocity of his thoughts. By the time we reached the gates of Blackwood Hall, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long, bruised shadows across a sprawling estate that seemed to breathe with a heavy, unnatural stillness. The manor house was a grim Gothic pile of red brick and grey stone, but it was the structure behind it that arrested our attention. Stretching nearly 100 yards into the encroaching mist was a massive conservatory of iron and glass, its panes fogged with an internal heat that defied the winter chill. It glowed with a faint, verdant luminescence, standing out against the dead landscape like a tropical fever dream. "The gardener's sanctum," Holmes whispered, stepping down from the carriage and checking the action of his heavy cane. "Be on your guard, Watson. We are no longer in the realm of logic and law, we are in a nursery for madness." Lestrade and his men took up positions around the perimeter, their dark capes blending into the shrubbery, while Holmes and I approached the glasshouse. As we entered through a heavy brass door, the air hit us like a physical blow, saturated with moisture and the overwhelming, dizzying scent of 1,000 different blooms. It was a cathedral of greenery, filled with plants that seemed to pulse with a low, vibrant life. Ferns as large as trees brushed against the glass roof, and vines with fleshy, purple-veined leaves wound around the iron pillars like tightening ligatures. "Look there, Watson," Holmes said, pointing to a raised dais in the center of the humid forest. Seated in a high-backed wicker chair was a man of immense age, his skin so pale and translucent it looked like wet parchment. He was surrounded by rows of the same white lilies we had seen at Baker Street, but these were different, larger, with petals that seemed to shiver even in the still air. He held a small silver watering can, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were tending to a sleeping child. "Sir Julian Blackwood," Holmes announced, his voice carrying through the humid air with a startling clarity. "The man who funded the grotto, the man who dreamed of a London cleansed by the mud of the Amazon." I believe your harvest is late this year, Sir Julian." The old man did not look up immediately. He finished watering a cluster of lilies before turning his watery, ancient eyes toward us. "Sherlock Holmes," he murmured, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. Vane was a brilliant student, but he lacked the patience of a true horticulturalist. He wanted the storm. I prefer the slow, steady growth of the root. "You used your position in the city to fund a massacre," I said, my hand tightening on my revolver. "You murdered Arthur Pinner and nearly took the life of George Morstan." "Murder?" Sir Julian chuckled, a wet, rattling sound. "I merely pruned the garden. The weak and the bureaucratic are the weeds that choke the progress of the species. Vane's vapor was not a weapon, Dr. Watson. It was a fertilizer. It was meant to prepare the soil for a new aristocracy of the mind." "An aristocracy of corpses," Holmes retorted, stepping onto the dais. He gestured to the glass roof above. "The canisters we found at the station were only the beginning. You have a central distribution hub here, don't you? Connected to the main water table that feeds the Surrey reservoirs." Sir Julian's smile widened, revealing yellowed teeth. A gardener must ensure his plants have a steady supply of nutrients. "By tonight, the terminus will be reached not just at a station, but in every home that draws from the southern lines. A gentle sleep, a silent end, and a world made fresh for those of us who know how to survive the mud." He reached for a heavy lever hidden amongst the ferns. "You are too late, Mr. Holmes. The valves are already open. The scent you smell. It is not just lilies." I felt a sudden, familiar tingling in my nostrils, the same sharp, ozone-like sting I had felt at the station. The mist within the greenhouse was thickening, turning a faint, sickly green. "The glass, Watson! Break the glass!" Holmes roared. But the conservatory was reinforced with wire mesh, designed to withstand the heaviest gales. As I fired my revolver into the nearest pane, the bullet merely starred the glass. The old man laughed, a sound that was cut short by a sudden, violent coughing fit. The vapor was filling the room, and even the gardener was not immune to his own final harvest. "The ventilation lever, Holmes," I cried, pointing to a brass wheel near the ceiling, entwined with thick, thorny vines. Holmes didn't hesitate. He began to climb the iron pillar with an agility born of desperation, his hands bleeding as he tore through the thorns. Below us, Sir Julian slumped in his chair, the silver watering can falling from his lifeless hand and clattering onto the stone floor. The white lilies around him seemed to lean in, as if to catch his final breath. With a heave that made the entire structure groan, Holmes wrenched a wheel. The great glass panels of the roof swung open, and the freezing winter air rushed in, swirling the green vapor upward and out into the night. Holmes collapsed onto the dais, gasping for the clean, cold air, while I stumbled toward him, my head spinning. The threat was over. The gardener had died in his own garden, and the silent partner of Silas Vane had reached his own final terminus. As the mist cleared, the white lilies looked smaller, less monstrous, merely flowers again, fragile and fleeting. "A near thing, Watson," Holmes panted, looking down at the silent form of Sir Julian. The most dangerous man in England was not the one with the knife or the gun, but the one with the silver watering can. We walked out into the cold Surrey night, the stars beginning to pierce the fog. The case was closed, the logic of the grotto exposed, and as we headed back toward the lights of London, I knew that for all its darkness, the world was a little safer for the man who walked beside me, the one man who could navigate the mud and still find the truth.